Good morning, everyone, and thank you all so much for joining us on this webinar that focuses on responding to racial bias and microaggressions in the online environment. We decided to do this particular webinar on this topic after getting many requests from colleagues across the country who've been dealing with racial microaggressions in their online courses, social media, and other virtual spaces, as we've had to make this transition to remote teaching and student services in response to the COVID pandemic. I am Dr. Frank Harris III. I'm a professor of post-secondary education at San Diego State University. I also co-direct the Community College Equity Assessment Lab. And I'm joined by my colleague, Dr. J. Luke Wood, who serves as Chief Diversity Officer at San Diego State University. Throughout this webinar, we will invite you to post thoughts and reactions on social media using the hashtag #EquityOnline. You have two options for posing questions. You can use Twitter and the hashtag #EquityOnline, as I just shared. And you can also post your questions in the chat on YouTube. Now, please keep in mind that there are more than 5,000 people who are registered for this webinar. So of course, we're not going to be able to get to every question, but we will get to as many as we can. Also want to make a note that this webinar is being recorded and a captioned version of it will be shared sometime shortly after. There are two objectives for this webinar. First, we'll spend some time describing the concepts of racial microaggressions. We recognize and understand that many of you have already heard of this concept and may have already gotten some training on it. But in today's webinar, we will make two important connections. First, we will discuss how racial microaggressions are rooted in our implicit bias. And second, we will discuss racial microaggressions within the context of COVID-19. And lastly, and perhaps most important, we're going to present a framework that we've developed to guide educators' responses to racial microaggressions and talk about how this framework can be applied in online environments. Here we have three definitions of implicit bias. Now, I won't take the time to read each of them, but I will highlight some cross-cutting themes that we see. First, we see that implicit bias is reflected in our unconscious thoughts and assumptions that are derived from our past experiences. Second, even though we're not aware of our implicit biases, they motivate our thoughts and actions. And third, regardless of who we are all susceptible to the effects of implicit bias. Let's talk about the conditions under which implicit bias is most likely to be activated. The research tells us that implicit bias is the result of system one thinking. System one thinking is characterized by reasoning and sense-making that occurs unconsciously. Thinking that is implicit and operating slightly, system one thinking is also implicit and it operates slightly below our level of awareness. And it is often automatic and occurs with very little intentional effort. In contrast, when we have system two thinking, this is characterized by reasoning that is very conscious and explicit, and that we're keenly aware of what we're thinking and the actions that are motivated by our thoughts. The metaphor that I often find helpful in comparing system one and system two thinking is that of driving a stick shift car. When we're learning to drive a stick shift car, we must exert a lot of effort in coordinating when and how we shift from one speed to the next, while also managing the clutch, braking, and following the basic rules of the road. It takes quite a bit of concentration when we're first learning. Now, eventually, as we become more comfortable with how the vehicle operates and the rules of the road, this process becomes second nature. We're able to manage it without giving it much thought and can even multitask while doing so. The research also tells us that system one thinking and thus implicit bias is more likely to be activated when the following conditions are present. situations that involve ambiguous or incomplete information, circumstances in which time is constrained, and times in which cognitive control is compromised. Now, I think if we reflect back upon the last, say, 4 to 6 weeks, when many of us have had to make this rapid transition to remote learning and to serving students online and to setting up student support online, I would say that these 3 conditions have probably been omnipresent during those last few weeks. And so we have to recognize that when we're in situations like this, when we have high stress, high pressure, we're much more likely to activate and fall into the traps of our implicit bias. There's also a concept called the primacy effect that relates to implicit bias. And the primacy effect tells us that individuals tend to give more weight to information presented earlier when forming opinions and making decisions. And then finally, we have to be mindful of the factors that influence our thoughts and feelings when our implicit bias is most present. And this relates directly to the concept I just shared in the previous slide on the primacy effect. Information that we consume in the media, be it on television or online, has some influence in the formations of the primacy effect, nonverbal behavior of others. This is especially salient amongst children. There have been lots of research studies that examine the ways in which preschool children react to adults' nonverbal behavior towards other children and trying to understand implicit and unconscious bias. We also have to think about the attitudes of friends and family members, particularly those who we've spent a lot of time with, and especially during our earlier years. We can think about things that we often overhear from adult friends and family members about certain groups of people and how that may have some effect on our implicit bias. And then interactions, particularly early interactions that we have with groups who are different from us, that has some influence on our implicit bias. Observations of social roles is another example. One of the most salient examples that I could offer regarding this factor is Black men who are routinely presented as athletes in the media and in society at large. So rarely are Black men presented or portrayed as doctors, lawyers, corporate executives, or even professors. And then, consequently, many people assume that Black men who are successful had to achieve their success in the context of sport. And then finally, there's the perception of social value. The values that are placed upon certain social identities affect the implicit assumptions we make about these identities. As we all know, some identities are privileged, and while others are marginalized. And it's this interplay between privileged identities and marginalized identities that has some influence on the social value that's placed upon those identities, and ultimately our implicit associations about them.
Thank you, Frank, for turning it over. I'm glad everyone to be able to be here to talk with you about this important topic of microaggressions and implicit bias and how this all plays out in our current context. So in the work that we do, we are informed by Daryl Wing Su's and Pierce's work on microaggressions. And Daryl Wing Su defines racial microaggressions as brief and commonplace, daily, verbal, behavioral, or environmental indignities, whether intentional or unintentional, that communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative racial slights and insults towards people of color. So ultimately, microaggressions are those subtle forms of discrimination that occur. They can be subtle snubs, they can be put downs, they can be dismissive looks. We do know that they are pervasive. They are part of the normal daily experience of people, in particular people of color in our society. These messages serve to invalidate our experiences and the intellectual capabilities of people of color. And we'll specifically talk about the different subtypes of these microaggressions in our examples. Some research has shown that they can be more psychologically damaging than direct forms of racism because there's a difficulty in placing where is this message coming from. The person who's the recipient can say, is it me? Is it something that I've done? Am I over-attributing things? And in reality, what it really is a subtle form of racism. And that's why Gloria Ladson Billings and a number of other scholars refer to this as 1,000 daily cuts. Now, from our perspective, microaggressions, bias, and subtle forms of discrimination are more prevalent now than ever before. As Frank mentioned, the conditions for bias are greater now with incomplete information is pervasive, our time is constrained, we're experiencing stress, individuals are in heightened emotional states. Furthermore, in an online environment, intention is harder to read. So facial expressions and mood changes that we would see in person are harder to be able to gauge. And if we're thinking about what might be in the written context, whether it's in an email or a discussion post, context is often not embedded within those. So we don't know exactly where the person is coming from or what they're really communicating. And so all of this can basically lead to a environment of microaggressions in this current society. Next slide. Now we have to think about how microaggressions then have an effect on us. So according to Nadal and colleagues, and the references there, if you want to see it on the slides, it says individuals who perceive and experience racial microaggression in their lives are likely to exhibit negative mental health symptoms such as depression, anxiety, negative affect or negative view of the world, and lack of behavioral control. A higher cumulative experience with racial microaggressions may predict more mental health problems. Second, higher cumulative experiences of racial microaggressions predicted depressive symptoms and one's affect or how positively or negatively one views the world. In our work on students, we have looked specifically at about how racial microaggressions influence our students, particularly our students of color. And we see very clearly that it can lead to a lower self-esteem, that it can lead to a sense of isolation and less of a sense of belonging. It can contribute to emotional exhaustion. It makes students feel invalidated, to self-doubt what they're doing, to have a greater feel of failure. And ultimately, we can see that it can also result in causing a student to reconsider their academic or career goals. It is not uncommon, for example, in the literature to talk about a student changing their major from one major to the other major because they've been told so many times that this is a major that's not for them. Next slide. So on the next slide, what we talk about is addressing microaggressions. So let's say that you've been microaggressed. Let's say that someone has said something to you that is a subtle racial slight or insult. And then you bring that back to the person and you confront that behavior. Well, most of the time we find that when this occurs, the person has a problem or a challenge in being able to accept that critique. Because as in general, we think of ourselves as good people who are caring and ethical. So if someone brings up behavior that we've done that can be either racist or discriminatory, it can be difficult for those individuals to comprehend what is actually taking place. And so you may have found that when you have seen a microaggression occur and have brought it to someone's attention, or that you have heard something that has been said that is, again, a subtle snub, that when you confront the person who said it, oftentimes what we find is that they will explain away the microaggression. They might become defensive or even accuse you of offending them. And oftentimes we can see that what would be a rational response isn't rational because people, again, have a harder time placing exactly how they should respond. Now, on the next slide, we talk about different types of microaggressions. So according to Daryl Wing Su, in that definition, you can see that they can be environmental, they can be behavioral, they can be, in this case, you can see public or private, and they can also be verbal or written or nonverbal. And basically, when we create this chart here, it shows that there's lots of different types of microaggressions. So for example, a public microaggression that's verbal can be a faculty member saying to a student of color, "Wow, you're so articulate," with a sense of surprise. Or in a private context, it may be in a one-on-one or a small group context, a staff member saying to a student that you're different than the rest of them, right? Separating them from their group in some sort of psychological way. They can also be nonverbal. They can be images or that are denigrating or exclusionary. We could have seen a pervasive presence of memes, of posters, of images that have really betrayed our Asian American community in a negative light during the COVID pandemic. They can also be nonverbal in a public setting. One thing that we talk about is the step back. a faculty member who's, say, teaching in their class, and let's say this is going pre-COVID, so we're in the classroom and students are walking up to the faculty member at the end of the class to have a conversation, and students are approaching from all different angles. And then let's say on the left-hand side of the faculty member approaches a darker skinned Latino male. And that faculty member just sees that person just out of the periphery view. And just at that very glance, their initial response is to step back, to put more distance between themselves and that student. Ultimately, that step back is a function of an assumption of criminality. And they've been trained to perceive this individual in that way. And so there's a step back that can take place. Or it can be in a private setting that's nonverbal, where someone avoids getting on the elevator. Now, I've had a lot of people who've said to me, but yeah, I might avoid getting on the elevator with anybody who is of a certain background. Let's say that's anybody who is a man, right? Because, you know, I might be fearful of how they might respond to me. And I think that the response that we have to have in terms of determining whether it's a microaggression or not is, do you do that more often when that person is a person of color? And if the answer to that is yes, then we would have to recognize that it may come from a negative space. On the next slide, what we want to talk about are the influence of microaggressions. So with microaggressions, it's not what's said, it's what's really said. So it's not what's said, it's what's really said. So for example, someone might say to a person, wow, you write so well. That's what's said. But what's really said is, I didn't think that you would be intelligent or capable. Someone might say to another student, can I see your ID, as a student's walking on campus at nighttime? That's what's said, but what is really said is, I assume that you're here to steal something. So what's said and what's really said are two different, come out of microaggressions. Now, here's some things about what are really said: that you're different from us, that you don't belong here, that you're not intelligent or capable, that people of color are lazy and they don't care, that you're a criminal or dangerous, or that you are not of worth. So very different messages that can have different connotations. Now, on the next slide, what we do is we show that there are different types of microaggressions. So one that's not depicted here is what's called a micro assault, which is really kind of like old school racism. But we're not talking about that today, as much as we're talking about micro insults and micro invalidations. So, and you can see that there are micro insults and micro invalidations, and listed below them are different subtypes. Ultimately, you can either be insulted or your experience and perceptions can be invalidated. And these are the two different types. In our research, we find that micro insults are most pervasive in educational contexts, and that of the micro insults, that the most pervasive ones, particularly for our students of color, are ascriptions of intelligence, where we assume that students are less intelligent; assumptions of criminality, where we assume that they are here because they have a deviant or criminalized perception; and then second-class citizenship, where we think of them as being lesser than. For example, you know, it could be that someone is assumed that they cannot be an essential worker because they're a person of color, when we know that essential workers can be individuals with all kinds of different backgrounds, right? So these kind of things where we think of people as being lesser than in some way. Another one that we see very often is on the bottom right is denial of individual racism. So many institutions at this point have mechanisms for when students experience racism for them to report it. How often in this current COVID environment have students reported challenges with faculty members or staff members, and those challenges have gone unresponded to? Okay, so on the next slide, what we want to do is show you the ones that we're going to be focusing on today. And don't worry, today is not going to be a day of theory as much as it is going to be a day of talking through what we can do about it. But we do want to touch on these examples to help frame what microaggressions look like, particularly micro insults in an online environment. So let's take the first one, ascriptions of intelligence. On your next slide, what you're going to see is a definition from that from Daryl Wing Su. And it is assigning a degree of intelligence to a person of color based on their race. And what we have are some examples of what this might look like. And as I go through the examples, here's a few things to know. One, what you see on the slide may not be the full quote, so I'll read the larger quote with the three periods, the ellipses really representing that there's more information there. And the second is that these are based on real life experiences. So what we've done is we've taken other examples of microaggressions. We've also reached out to colleagues who've given us examples. And so these are like real life examples of what microaggressions could look like in this environment. So let's take the first one, a phone call. The professor called me about a week after I submitted my paper. She said, "I read your paper. Wow, you wrote this?" They were shocked that I could write. Again, this is a sense of surprise about intelligence. The next one is what could occur during a private chat. During the session, another student sent me an email asking if I understood the material being taught. I believe the assumption was that I didn't know. I took great offense to it. It wasn't her position to check my understanding. Another one is in a Zoom breakout session. In my Zoom breakout session, so in Zoom, right, you can have the larger room, but then you can create a breakout which has a smaller group of students. And it says in my Zoom breakout group, I answered a question. Then one of the men in the class said, "You're smart for a Black girl." He meant it as a joke or a compliment or maybe both, but either way, I didn't like it. Another set of examples is on your next slide. And these also deal with different ways in which an ascription of intelligence can play out. And the first one is from a GroupMe, which is kind of like a private chat application software. And it says, "I'm the only Latina in my class. After the exam, we shared our scores in the GroupMe. I told them I got an A. Someone wrote, 'Wow, that's really high. You should be proud.' It stood out to me because countless other people said the same thing, that they got the same grade, and received no response of that nature." Another one is what could occur when students are working in group projects in a Google Hangout. My group has to meet over Google Hangout. When I give out ideas, they ignore me like I don't exist or that my ideas are bad. I'm the only person of color in the group. And then here's one from office hours, for online office hours with the faculty. I attended the online office hours. It is like group office hours, so I wasn't the only one there. Everyone got to ask a question and the instructor responded. I asked a question and he responded by speaking extra slow and exaggerating his pronunciation, like I didn't know English or something. He obviously doesn't think I'm smart. These are all different examples of ascription of intelligence. But let's move to assumptions of criminality, because this is another subtype that's very common. And this is when we assume that a person of color is dangerous, criminal, or deviant based on their race. So again, here's some examples that would be applicable to our current context. One is in a discussion board post. And someone wrote, "I'm sorry, I'm not trying to be racist, but people of color come from neighborhoods with lots of crime. It's a fact, just watch the news." And we know that in discussion boards, it's hard to have certain types of conversations when those aren't facilitated, which would be better facilitated in maybe a Zoom breakout session or another type of modality. Here's one, a Zoom breakout room. Basically, they went from a larger room to a smaller room, and people and students were broken up into different groups. And it says, "I have to be honest. When I'm alone at night, there are times when I worry about being assaulted by a Black or Latino male. It's not that I'm racist, it's just a gut feeling that tells me I need to protect myself." So this is a conversation that students might have in a breakout room. And these, of course, harder to be able to monitor for faculty. Another one is a faculty saying something to a student assistant on a phone call, saying Latinx students are more likely to plagiarize on their papers than others. It's not that they're not smart, they just don't understand the language. Again, assuming both that they are criminal, but also an ascription of intelligence. And this is what we oftentimes see in our work, is that it's never usually just one microaggression, but multiple microaggressions combined in the context. On the next slide, you can see a couple more examples of these assumptions of criminality. This first one is an email response. I wrote the professor to let him know I wasn't able to attend class because my internet was down. He wrote back very condescendingly, insinuating that I was lying. I don't get it. Lots of people are having internet problems right now. He's such a jerk. This is one from virtual office hours. I asked my professor for an extension on the assignment during virtual office hours, which I was attending on my phone because my computer isn't working. She was like, "How come you didn't tell me earlier when you were having computer issues? If you would have, I would have been able to have granted the request." It was clear that she didn't believe me. I'm so done with this semester and this class. On the next slide, what you'll see are examples of second-class citizenship. This is when a white person or a person in the majority group, it can be given preferential treatment over a person of color. And here are some more examples that we might see in a Zoom context. So the first is from a discussion board, and this is actually based upon a pretty recent study out of Stanford University, where they were looking at 124 what are called MOOCs, massively open online courses. And basically what the researchers did is they created these accounts based upon different races and genders. And they basically said responding to discussion posts from white male students, ignoring posts from students of color. In their research, they found that white males were nearly twice as likely to receive a response from instructor on a post in comparison to other students, 12% in comparison to 7%. Or it could also happen in Zoom engagement. Here's the next one. My philosophy class began the semester in person, but as you know, because of COVID, it's now online. The instructor tries to facilitate the class the same way. She talks and then poses questions for us to engage. It's a bit more difficult online. You have to raise your virtual hand in Zoom to get called on, and getting called on is important because you need to get those participation points. But it feels like she never calls on me. It's like I don't exist. And here's another one in an instructor email. I just found this out. So apparently the professor has been reaching out to students to check in on them and see how they're doing. But he's only doing this with his favorite students, the ones who used to stand around him and talk with him after class. But all of us Black students know what that means, that he's not reaching out to us anytime soon. Now let's go to pathologizing culture. Pathologizing culture encompasses a couple of different concepts. It can be when we look at the values of a group that's different from us, framing students as they statements. They are lazy. They don't care. They're just here for the financial aid, as well as putting down communication styles that might be specific to a cultural group. So here's some examples of how we see pathologizing culture playing out in an online environment. So here's the first one is online office hours. So I logged on to the online office hours with the professor. I asked a question and his response was, did you do the readings? He assumed that I hadn't when I had. I mean, isn't that what online office hours are for? To ask questions to the professor? Clearly they assumed I was lazy and I didn't care. Next one is phone calls. I was on the phone with the basic needs coordinator. Basic needs coordinators are individuals who work with students who might experience food insecurity, housing insecurity, or like transportation concerns, etc. So I was on the phone with the basic needs coordinator because I heard there was emergency money from the federal government, something called the CARES funds. I don't know what it was, but they came off like I was just there for the money and I wasn't really committed to school. I can't put my finger on what it was, but the tone of the voice was clear to me. Here's another one, and this is a phone call. I got a call from my academic advisor to see how I was doing. It was nice at first. I was like, wow, that's very thoughtful of them. I said to them, can I ask you a question to get my grade turned to credit? They corrected me by saying, yes, you can ask me a question, emphasizing that I had said ask wrong. It was so unnecessary and so condescending and very unproductive. Here's another set of examples on pathologizing culture. This is from a Zoom breakout room. Someone wrote, if Blacks made healthier choices about what they eat and stopped drinking and smoking, then so many of them wouldn't be dying from COVID-19. Another one, and this is in a private Zoom message. So sometimes when you're on Zoom, you can send a message to other people who are part of the session without all of the other attendees seeing what you've written. And this one happened. So during class, we sometimes write one another on the Zoom chat to help pass the time. Another student sent me a message that was clearly intended for someone else. It said, if they would stop spending their stipend checks on rims and sneakers, then they wouldn't be so hungry and homeless. Their name didn't appear, so I didn't know who it was. I wrote the professor afterwards, but I never heard back. The last two that I want to talk about are different norming and presumptions of defilement. So on the next slide is and different norming is when people assume they have the authority to negatively categorize or uncategorize people of color. And this is a concept that we've written about extensively, myself and my colleague Frank. And essentially think about it as when someone says something that is positive to a student while at the same time putting down their community. So here's the first one. This is in a group me. This is like again, a social media app that students can have small groups in and exchange and share information. We have a group me. We have a group me for those who are part of my project group. Mostly we share information on the assignment. However, one of the other students sent a meme about Chinese people that joked about them having the virus. I'm Asian, so I was pissed. I wrote back and said I didn't think it was funny. They called me directly to apologize and said, I don't think of you as Asian. When I was talking about them, I wasn't really talking about you. Here's another example on instructor feedback. The instructor put comments on my paper submission. 2 comments stood out to me. One said, you write well for a second language learner. By the way, I'm not a second language learner, but that's besides the point. The second comment was right after it said, well done. Why can't the others be like you? And then another example is a classroom interaction. The instructor let us pick our own groups for the final assignment. Usually I work with other Black students, but this time a group of white students reached out to me. They sent me a text message saying they wanted me to be in their group because you work hard. It didn't sit right with me because I knew they were suggesting that the other Black people didn't, which isn't even close to being true. And then the last example is what is called a presumption of defilement. And essentially, this is when communication is given to people of color that suggests that they are debased, physically dirty, infected, or diseased. So think about the examples of this being if you go and you sit on a bus and there's and you're on a bus and you see someone go and there's open seats and they avoid sitting next to a person of color because they think of them as being dirty. Or someone approaches you and washes and basically shakes your hand, and then afterwards they go to the bathroom to wash their hand, and they do that more often with people of color than they do with other people. Or if you've ever been in a swimming pool and you're a person of color and you notice that when you get in that people who aren't people of color then get out, then that's also an example of this. Or it could be that you're at the grocery store and that someone sees a person who may be of Asian descent and they walk farther away than the normal 6 feet than they would with anybody else because they assume that they are, again, these concepts. So here are just 2 quick examples. A class social site. So and this example is when you have like sometimes in a classroom where students will create a Facebook page where they can share information with one another. It's like a private page. And it said, our class had a closed Facebook page where we shared information with one another. There's a student on the page who's always posting memes that are meant to be funny, but sometimes they're just racist, like jokes about the Chinese virus and stuff, basically suggesting that all Asians have the virus. I think they think that it's funny, but I don't. But I'm not trying to make a big deal about it or anything. Another one is a profile icon that might be in a group chat where essentially you can have a picture of yourself, but instead of using a picture, this is what happened. Some people have uploaded profile icon pictures in our group chat that are not pictures of themselves, but of Asian men with gas masks on. So all of these are examples of how these contexts can play out in an online environment. And now what I'm going to do is turn it back over to my colleague, Frank, who's going to talk about strategies and practices that we can employ to change what we're seeing. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Luke. And thank you all again for tuning in. What I like to do is turn the discussion now to some of the ways in which we can effectively respond to racial microaggressions. So in order to do so, I'm going to introduce you all to a framework that Luke and I developed as a way to respond to racial microaggressions. Now, when we first developed this framework, we didn't necessarily develop it for addressing racial microaggressions in online environments, but we find that a lot of the microaggressions that we see that happen in person also happen in online environments, but they play out in very different and seemingly more intentional ways. So it's a 5-step process that we call the R.A.V.E.N. And each step addresses the type of statement that we need to make in order to respond effectively to microaggressions. So going back to a slide that Luke shared not too long ago, think it's important to point out that the R.A.V.E.N works best when we're addressing microaggressions that are expressed verbally or in text and in a public setting. So when I think about a public setting, I'm thinking about 3 or more people. So classrooms obviously fall within that context. Meetings that take place on staff meetings, faculty meetings that take place on Zoom and so forth. And also I would say what's different about the online environment that we don't necessarily see in person is that this framework also works well with addressing nonverbal environmental microaggressions. So images and degrading images and racially salient images that are presented in online environments as well. So our first step, the first thing that we have to do is intervene. We have to redirect the conversation. We have to do something to stop further harm from taking place. And we have a lot of different options to do so. We can correct the person. If we were doing this in person, we would talk about pulling the person aside, saying, "Hey, Frank, I need to talk with you for a second." But no matter what, the key is that we have to stop the harm from continuing to happen. The second step is to ask probing questions. So ask things like, "I think I heard you say this. What exactly did you mean by that?" Or, "I want to make sure I understand exactly what you're saying. Are you suggesting that?" and so forth. And this step is important because what we want to do is get the person to pause, reflect, and to begin thinking critically about what they're saying. And this is important to do because remember, a lot of racial microaggressions are rooted in implicit bias. So oftentimes there's not a real conscious understanding of how, when someone who says something, why it's a microaggression and why it's harmful. And this gives the person an opportunity to sort of create some cognitive dissonance that can disrupt the pattern of thinking that's happening, making the unconscious more conscious. We also want to make sure that we give the person a chance to clarify what they may have said. Sometimes we may misunderstand things and we may interpret something that we have read or heard. And this step provides an opportunity for seeking clarity. Next, we have to engage in what we call a clarification of values. So, reminding the person that what they're saying or what they've posted, the way that they're treating other people is not appropriate and is not aligned with the values or expectations of our classroom, our community, our workplace, or whatever it may be. And some examples of that is about, in this department, we work hard to create a space that's safe and welcoming for all students. We could take the same example, in our class, in our department, it's really important that students feel safe and welcome to come to us to ask for support, whatever it may be. And then to remind them what they said or what they've done that is not in alignment and is inconsistent with the values that we prioritize, especially if we work at colleges or universities. They all tend to have statements on diversity, statements on equity, statements on inclusion, non-discrimination policies, and so forth. And this is an opportunity to connect to those processes and connect to some of those values. Now, we think it's important that you do that before you actually, have to refer back to those things. So if you're starting a class, for example, if you're teaching a class on the first day of class, when you're reviewing the syllabus, talking about what are the values, what are the norms, what are the expectations, and so forth, so that when you actually have to rely on this, students are already familiar, the people in which you're working with, colleagues, they're already familiar with the values that we've all committed to by being in this space collectively. Next, it's important to express empathy. So, statements like, "When I hear your comment, I think and feel this way," or "People may take what you had to say to mean this," or "In my experience, when someone says this or does this, this is the consequences of it." So this is why this is an important step. Oftentimes, we assume that the person who's the target of the microaggression is the only person that's harmed by it. And when in fact, we find that those who observe it are also harmed by it, that when someone is microaggressive, especially in an online environment, it really has a very negative and damaging effect and creates a hostile climate for everyone in that space. And so it's important to say, hey, it's not just about what you said to that person, And maybe I'm not the target of it, but I don't appreciate what's said, and I find it troubling as well. And we have to be forthcoming about this, and we have to be as transparent as we can be about this. And then the last step of the R.A.V.E.N. It's always important to end the conversation with some concrete, constructive feedback, concrete next steps, give the person some guidance about how they should act next time they find themselves in a similar situation, refer them to resources, readings, things that they should do, trainings, things that they should do to build their capacity to make sure that they don't commit a microaggressive act again. Now, here's the thing to keep in mind. You don't have to follow these steps exactly as they're laid out. So sometimes, for example, you might engage in a clarification of values after you've empathized and emphasized your own thoughts and feelings, or you might make a statement that simultaneously accomplishes both of these steps. So even though we're presenting this, as a framework, as a systematic process, it's really about guiding thoughts and guiding the things that you would say in order to disrupt microaggressions in the moment. So here's what we're going to do now. We're going to share 4 scenarios that involve one or more microaggressions, most of them involving more than one. And then we're going to kind of talk about how we would respond to each of these scenarios using some of the steps of the R.A.V.E.N. So let's take the first one that we see. In my sociology class, we were responding to a prompt on a discussion board about how race is a socially constructed concept and how the meanings we assign to race comes from society. This one student wrote in and said, we should get rid of the concept of race. If no one has to identify as a race, then there isn't room to be racist and minorities can stop playing the race card. I responded and explained that race isn't the problem, but racism is, and how racism is a systemic issue that is rooted in institutions, not just people. I pointed to COVID-19 and how more minorities were dying from it than whites as an example. He said this was a figment of my imagination and that, quote, people like me, unquote, were overly sensitive and need to just stop whining about everything. So this microaggressor is not only microaggressing on the basis of color blindness, in that he advocates that people of color's racial identities are not important and shouldn't be acknowledged. There's also the denial of individual racism when he suggests that people of color are overly sensitive when it comes to race and equates their advocacy for racial equity to whining. Now, in applying the R.A.V.E.N., one thing that we can do to intervene, right, in that first step is to say that it's okay to critique ideas, but not to resort to personal attack. This would also be a good idea to remind the student about the community norms and expectations for engaging in critical dialogue, right? So hopefully, as an instructor in this course, you've already established some norms and some expectations around, it's okay to be critical of ideas, but we don't attack people. We don't attack groups of people based on their identity. And again, to remind them about these are the norms, these are the rules in which that's going to govern our engagement in discussing some of these difficult issues. We can also ask questions like, thinking about that next step of the R.A.V.E.N., are you suggesting that racism doesn't really exist and that people of color's lives are not affected by racism? Another question we could ask, wouldn't you agree that being able to ignore or disregard race is a privilege that is only afforded to whites because people of color are reminded every day about their racial status in the United States? So those, again, questions when we think about probing questions. With regard to expressing empathy, we could say, I often find myself frustrated when people who haven't walked in my shoes and experienced some of the things that I've had to deal with tell me to get over it. I would imagine this is how most people of color feel when people tell them to stop playing the race card and to get over racism. And then finally, with regard to the last step, again, it would be a good idea to direct the student, and maybe not just this student, but direct the entire class to some readings, or a TED Talk or some kind of scholarly lecture on systemic racism, right? And again, just thinking about how we might use the R.A.V.E.N. to guide the ways in which we respond if we were the faculty member, for example, in this particular situation. Okay, let's take our second scenario. In my marketing class, we had to work in groups to come up with an image that could be used to brand a product or a service. This one group thought it was a good idea to come up with an image that portrayed Asian Americans in a stereotypical way. You know, there's a lot of negative rhetoric on social media about people of Chinese descent right now. It was clearly racist, no doubt about it. When the professor asked the group to explain why this image would be an effective way to sell a product or service, they said the product was targeting the Asian market and resorted to more racist stereotypes about Asians to justify it. It was disgusting. I am not Asian, but it made me really mad because I know we have Asian students in our class who are probably uncomfortable. In this scenario, the pathologizing culture, microaggression occurs, particularly when the student assumes that racial stereotypes are an effective way to get buy-in from Asian communities, as opposed to a well-thought and a well-crafted message that conveys respect and appreciation for their cultures. So if I were in this situation, a good way to redirect and stop further harm from happening is to stop the presentation and remind students about how Asian Americans are being unfairly blamed for being responsible for COVID-19 and are the targets of hate crimes because of this, and that images like the one that they've created only deepens the hate and the misunderstanding. It's important that they hear that and that you're very clear and transparent about that. Next, we could ask the students to articulate their perceptions of Asian Americans and share how the image they created is aligned with what they think of and assume about Asian Americans. Again, creating some cognitive dissonance, getting them to recognize and understand how what they're doing and what they're saying and what they may perceive is problematic. We also need to acknowledge our own feelings and discomfort that result from the image and talk about how it may have created a hostile environment for the entire class, especially those who are part of the Asian American community. And again, make a connection to the norms and expectations of the class. And then lastly, with regard to next steps, I would require this group to do some research, do some scholarly research, perhaps go and talk with colleagues on campus who's doing some research or who have some expertise in Asian American cultures, and have them come up with another way to, and have them redo the assignment is what I think would be appropriate in this situation. Okay, next one. I'm the faculty advisor for a student organization that supports undocumented students and allies at our college. We have a Facebook page. One day, this faculty member from our college started posting derogatory messages. At first, the messages were memes that depicted undocumented students as criminals and were accompanied with smiley faces to insinuate it was a joke. Then it went to direct statements about how these students don't belong here and that they're taking resources away from, quote, tax-paying citizens who deserve them, unquote. Some of the students in the organization were really upset because they may have to take a class from this professor and were concerned that he would retaliate against them if he knew they were a part of the group. Okay, this one is very challenging and multifaceted. So first we see the assumption of criminality and pathologizing culture by saying that undocumented students are, quote, criminals, unquote, and suggesting that they are taking resources away from more deserving taxpayers. The second class citizen microaggression also occurs based on the assumption that only folks who are documented should get support and those who aren't should not. And with regard to applying the R.A.V.E.N, this faculty member's comment needs to be removed. He should no longer have access to the Facebook page because his comments are causing irreparable harm and trauma to a student population that is already experiencing vulnerability. So, in terms of redirecting is to get the comments off and to get him removed from this community. Next, I think it would be important to contact the faculty member directly, reminding him of not only the college's values, but also the college's policies on supporting all students, including those who may be undocumented. And then finally, I would ask, how would he feel if one of the students in the group were one of his children or a family member? How would he feel if they were targeted in a way that he came after these students? Again, talking about empathy and emphasizing your feelings. I would also remind him of the tremendous privilege that comes with being an educator, and that with this privilege comes a huge responsibility and an expectation to do no harm to students. And then this last step is really important here. It's important to connect with each student in the group, offer them resources, offer them support, offer them advocacy if they need it, and offer them alternatives for those who may have to take a course from this faculty member. Give them opportunities and alternatives for taking another class, but not putting themselves in this context for fear of retaliation from this particular issue. Okay, here's our last scenario, and then we're gonna wrap it up with a final set of recommendations. I was serving on the search committee for a position at my college. There's been a big focus on hiring more faculty and staff of color, so we can be more reflective of our student body. Of course, we got lots of applicants, so it was a pretty competitive search. And it's hard to run a search on Zoom. There were some folks on the committee who expressed the importance of getting a quote quality unquote candidate and not making the decision based on race. Several of us on the committee were immediately triggered by this and asked if they were saying that we couldn't get a quality candidate who was also a person of color. One committee member responded with, quote, "No, I'm not saying that, but I do think it's important that white candidates have a fair chance too." Then someone suggested that we modify the search process to make sure there would be no bias. So, of course, the most glaring microaggression that we see in this scenario is the myth of meritocracy. And that some committee members assume that being intentional in hiring a person of color meant that quality could be compromised. I felt that actually the committee member who spoke up did a great job of redirecting the conversation and asking them to clarify their position on candidates of color and quality. If I were to further this discussion, I would have maybe reminded them that there were outstanding colleagues, some of whom are on the committee that were also people of color, and that hiring them was by no means a sacrifice of quality. I would also remind them of the college's values regarding equity, diversity, and inclusion, and why it's important to our students that their success, to our students and their success, that we bring in more faculty and staff of color, be it on this search or others that the campus was involved in. We could also emphasize that it's both insulting and inherently racist to suggest that the search process be modified as to not favor a person of color, especially given the college's longstanding history of using this search process that resulted in the hiring of disproportionately more white faculty and staff. And finally, in offering next steps, it would be good to send the committee some readings, or the whole committee, some readings on the extensive body of research on implicit bias in hiring. And I know we're actually a minute past time, so I'm going to move through these last slides fairly quickly. But to conclude, we do want to offer these final recommendations. Remember, microaggressions are rooted in implicit bias, and implicit bias is most likely activated when we're stressed and pressured to get things done quickly. So it's important to slow down, be reflective, and think about our actions. Think about our thoughts and be conscious of our actions that result from them. Second, take the time to learn about racial microaggressions. The more you learn, the less likely you'll be to commit them, and the more effective you'll be in responding to them. And I also think it's important to teach students and colleagues about them as well. Sharing readings, share information about microaggressions, how common they are, and of course about the detrimental effects on students of color, people of color, I should say. Next, it's important to establish and model community norms. In working through the scenarios that I just shared, I think in each scenario we talked about the importance of having a clear set of norms, a clear set of community values, and being able to rely on those in addressing microaggressions. So I think that's important to do. We have to model these norms on a consistent basis, and we have to call out folks who violate them. So in many ways, these norms will be your saving grace. It's something you can reference when having to respond to a microaggression. Next, we have to acknowledge the realities of race. It's important to understand we live in a racially salient society. especially in the current political context, which is very anti-immigrant and anti-minority. Given this, racial microaggressions are going to be more persistent in today's context. In addition, people often say things online that they wouldn't necessarily say in person. And so we have to be hyper vigilant in monitoring virtual communities that we're responsible for. I think it's important if we're leading conversations on Zoom or we're running classes on Zoom that we are checking in and joining those breakout groups to make sure that some of the examples that Luke shared were not happening. And if they are happening, then we're actually in a position to intervene. And it's important for students to know that we're present in those contexts as well. Next, we have to gain a greater sense of self and be more reflective. The more we learn about ourselves and the more that we make our implicit bias more transparent, the more successful we'll be in avoiding and addressing racial microaggressions. So I would encourage everyone to go online, Google Project Implicit and take the implicit association test. Learn where some of your blind spots are and make sure you take some intentional steps to address them. And of course, I would encourage colleagues to do the same. Next, we have to consistently convey authentic care and high expectations. When our default is to be validating and to let students know that we care about them and care about our success, then this actually becomes a part of our system one thinking. And so it's important that we really take some intentional steps to do so. Next, we have to embrace opportunities for meaningful cross-racial interaction, seek out opportunities to engage meaningfully with people who are different from us. This is not only helpful when it comes to microaggressions, but it's also important because it helps us all grow and mature as people, and it's an important life skill in society. So it's important that we do so. And then finally, we have to take ownership of our mistakes. When we screw up, and we all screw up at one point or another, it's important that we take ownership. Don't avoid it. Don't become defensive. Be humble and assume some personal accountability. So again, with that, I want to thank you all for joining us on this webinar, and I believe we're going to spend a few minutes responding to questions. I'm going to now turn it back over to Luke to get us started.
All right, everyone, we're going to take just a handful of questions today since we're already at time. And what we'll be doing is taking the questions from two different points. You can either post them in the chat window. We're also monitoring social media as well as the chat feature and comment feature on YouTube. So with that, we can go ahead and get started. One of the questions is, can you talk about the emotional energy being used to step up and into these scenarios of microaggressions? So I think it's certainly appropriate to recognize that the individuals who engage as upstanders using this framework, particularly if they come from minoritized communities themselves, that there is emotional labor that goes along with that. However, in our framework, what you'll notice is that the person who is engaging is the person who heard the event, not the person who experienced the event. And the reason for that is that we believe that when microaggressions occur, that harm has taken place, that harm has been done. Therefore, we don't want that person who's been harmed having to be the person who has to step up for themselves. So there is big emotional labor that comes with this. I also think on our end, in doing this work as people of color who also experience these microaggressions often ourselves, that there is labor that comes along with that as well. However, we believe that as part of our duty, that it's important for us to be engaged in recognizing this and being attentive to this. And then Frank, there's a question that I think you might want to address on racial battle fatigue and maybe talking about William Smith's work on that.
Okay, can you read the question? I can't see it.
It just says, can you talk about how this connects to racial battle fatigue?
Yeah, of course. So I would encourage everyone to take a look at William Smith, who's a professor at the University of Utah's work. And what he does is takes this conversation regarding racial microaggressions a step further and actually talks about the physical and psychological consequences of being in context and where you are consistently experiencing microaggressions. So he talks about things like acute stress, anxiety, hypervigilance, headaches, and all sorts of things that people of color experience on a fairly regular basis, but we don't necessarily connect these issues to the environments, the races and racially salient environments in which we find ourselves. And so, I think that would be important for anyone that's doing any additional reading and studying on this. I would very much encourage you all to take a look at the work on racial battle fatigue.
The next question basically asked about Project Implicit. Someone was asking for clarification on that. And then Frank, can you go back to the slide that showed the R.A.V.E.N approach? There's a lot of folks, a lot of questions asking about what different letters in the framework refer to. But as you can see on your screen, R is for redirect, A is for asking questions, V is for values clarification, E is for emphasizing your own thoughts and feelings, and then N is for next steps. There's another question that came in that's basically asking, hey, as a person who is white, I might say something positive to my students. How do I know I'm not microaggressing them? And essentially how the difference is the position that it comes from. Does it originate, let's say that you validate student on something that they've done in terms of a tangible work product. Are you doing it from a standpoint that's conveying a sense of surprise or that you didn't think that they could? Or are you doing it from a standpoint where you're simply congratulating them? And what we really find is that students are very attentive to the difference. So just making sure that you're doing that kind of gut check to make sure that you're coming from a right position. The other thing that I would say is important is to recognize that with microaggressions, that when students receive it, that's going to be also based upon the prior experience that they have with that faculty member. So if that faculty member or that staff member has been someone who's been supportive of them, who's advocated for them, they may read messages differently based upon what that existing relationship looks like. So that oftentimes is a harm reduction strategy as part of microaggressions, but just recognizing that the response is going to be a bit different. Here's a question, Frank, that you might want to address. It says, do you have some suggestions for using the R.A.V.E.N framework method with individuals who are steeped in specific types of mentalities?
Sorry, Luke, you cut out a little bit at the end.
They want to know about using what experience do we have actually using that framework?
Yeah, so obviously this is a framework that we use often. We've done a lot of training on racial microaggressions in a lot of different contexts. And, folks have found it helpful both in terms of learning about it, but also we've gotten a lot of responses about how they found it valuable in being able to disrupt and respond to racial microaggressions. Now, again, as I said earlier, when presenting the R.A.V.E.N, when we developed this, we didn't necessarily have an online, we didn't necessarily develop it for virtual environments. That was a large part of the work that we presented today, was to think about, how does this apply in virtual settings? Where I think it may give us, where virtual settings may help us to some degree, is that when someone is posting something in text, it actually gives us a little bit more time to be more thoughtful and reply, be more thoughtful in the response that we type out. And that's not something that we're always able to do when we're interacting verbally, be it in person or in Zoom or so forth. But we've also, of course, thinking about the work that we do here at San Diego State, serving on lots of committees, being involved in a lot of direct support work for students, we found this approach to be valuable in guiding our own work as well here.
The next question is from the YouTube, and it says, do you suggest making comments relative to the R.A.V.E.N approach privately or in a whole class? And my response to that is it really depends. If it is something that can be best addressed in a private manner, then I would do that. But if it's a statement that was public, that other people heard, it would be difficult to leave it as something that would be addressed private, because harm has been done, and without engaging in having some conversation around that, then you're really allowing that harm to manifest. So I would suggest that that if you have it occur in that public setting, that you should probably address it in that public setting. And remember that the framework, the second part of it, is really about asking questions. So you can use questions as a way of eliciting a better understanding of what someone said. So for example, if someone said, oh yeah, these students come from bad communities, or someone comes from a bad community, your response can be, tell me what you mean when you say bad. What does that mean to you? And use it as a way of eliciting their understanding of how what they had said may have been hurtful, and then working through the taxonomy, or this approach, this R.A.V.E.N approach with the class, we have found to be a very useful strategy and tactic. And then Frank, given that we're short on time, I'm going to give you the last question. And it just says, what guidance do you have for students who may fear retaliation from faculty when expressing their concerns about microaggressive behavior?
Yeah, I think it's important for students to not feel the pressure to take this on by themselves, or to directly confront a professor, especially if there's a real fear of retaliation. And so I think it's important to identify someone at the campus. It could be a dean, it could be an advisor, someone who you trust, someone who can be an advocate, and someone who can address the issue on your behalf. And then also, just someone who can talk about if there needs to be any formal grievances, formal grievance process that needs to be enacted, someone who can guide the student through that process as well. But educators have a responsibility to address these issues on behalf of students, especially when they bring them to our attention.
And with that, we're going to go ahead and close out this webinar. We really appreciate everyone's attendance and support. If you could just do one thing for us, and that is on the YouTube channel, if you could share this video on your social pages or with your colleagues. We just want to make sure that the important information that we believe we've shared today reaches people who really need to hear it. There was a lot of great questions and comments, and we're certainly looking forward to continuing to connect with those who participated. And then lastly, there was a number of questions about where people can get a copy of the R.A.V.E.N framework, like where can they go so they can cite it. We have a forthcoming op-ed focused on the R.A.V.E.N framework. We've been using it for several years, but we do have something that's written up that will come out, and we'll make sure to share that through those who are part of the listserv. So thank you again for joining today, and thank you for your advocacy for our underserved students. Have a great, wonderful day.
Thank you.